You are listening to The Central Cast, a podcast for mystics and misfits just like you, recorded every week in Pasadena, California, before a live audience. Thanks for tuning in. All right, thanks, guys. So today is not just the third Sunday of Black History Month, but it's also this week coming up is the beginning of Lent. This is going to be the first week of Lent. Excuse me as I choke on communion. With Ash Wednesday. How many of you know what Ash Wednesday is? Okay, most of you. How many of you grew up participating in a tradition with Ash Wednesday? Okay. Half of you maybe. This is the day, they call it Ash Wednesday because a priest in usually a high church tradition, so-called high church tradition, Lutherans, Methodists, Episcopals, Anglicans, Presbyterians, etc. They'll take ashes, right? And they'll make the sign of the cross with the ashes on the faithful's forehead while saying these words, "You are dust, and to dust you shall return." And the purpose behind this moment is to call people to meditate on their mortality, their frailty, death even. It's pretty somber. For the purpose of kind of embracing death, accepting our frailty, our mortality, as a way of refocusing ourselves on that which really matters in life. Things like love and beauty and connection and relationships. And so I want to do a Lenten meditation today on death, if you will, as a way of affirming life. And the way I want to do that is with the words of James Baldwin, who of course was, this is again Black History Month, so I'm going to use James Baldwin, famous Black voice, activist, author, philosopher. And this is an excerpt from his book, The Fire Next Time, which I read a few years ago. Fabulous book, relatively short, really easy read in some ways, but it's dense. There's a lot in there. You find yourself rereading paragraphs over and over again to get it. Anyway, so this is a quote from his book, The Fire Next Time. He says this, "Behind Black bodies is what white Americans do not wish to face, reality. The fact that life is tragic. Life is tragic simply because the earth turns and the sun rises and sets, and one day for each of us, the sun will go down for the last time. Perhaps the whole root of our trouble, the human trouble, is that we will sacrifice the beauty of our lives. We will imprison ourselves in totems, taboos, crosses, blood sacrifices, steeples, mosques, races, armies, flags, nations, in order to deny the fact of death, which is the only fact we have," he says. "It seems to me that one ought to rejoice in the fact of death. One ought to decide, indeed, to earn one's death." I love this language, to earn one's death by confronting with passion the conundrum of life. One is responsible to life, he says. It is that small beacon in that terrifying void from which we come and to which we shall return. One must negotiate this passage as nobly as possible for the sake of those who are coming after us." End quote. Baldwin is arguing here that white folk don't like Black folk often for the same reason the rich don't like the poor. The poor and the oppressed remind the rich and comfortable that life is tragic, and ultimately loss and death are coming for each and every one of us, regardless of our station in life. Death is the great equalizer, is it not? And people who have a lot of privilege, power, and wealth tend to hate this fact, perhaps more than anyone else, because they see themselves as having more to lose. And so they unconsciously project these fears of death onto the poor and people of color, Baldwin is saying. This, of course, is a kind of scapegoating. In other words, from Baldwin's point of view, racism is ultimately rooted in a fear of death and suffering and loss. The antidote for this, he says, is to face our fears and embrace death. This is something I think we talk a lot about here because it's basically the message behind a school of thought that's had a profound impact on me, radical theology. So if you've heard me talk about this before, aka death of God theology, kind of the school of thought that Peter Rollins comes out of, Jack Caputo and others. And radical theology is based on this interpretation of the cross that sees it as symbolizing, among other things, life as it really is, tragic, unfair. And this idea that no one, not even God, escapes death. The cross for me symbolizes life as it really is, and the fact that there is no supreme, all-powerful, supreme being on high who will swoop in like Superman and save the day if we just pray enough and believe enough. Therefore, we must save ourselves. We must become Christ in the world. We must become the presence and power of God in the world. God, you might say, is counting on us to do this. And this begins with acknowledging the reality of death, among other difficult truths. And I would argue this was part of the original understanding of the cross, albeit unconsciously, by these first Jesus followers, these Jewish folks who became disciples of Christ. I think unconsciously this was understood. And I think we should look at the story of a crucified God like the way a psychoanalyst, if you will, might interpret a client's dream. We all know that dreams, especially nightmares, are often, or they reveal that we're wrestling with stress or something. I don't know about you, but, I had that dream when I was in school of showing up to school one day naked, right? And some of you probably have had that. It's a very common dream. Well, what does the nakedness represent? Well, we're unprepared. We're anxious about school. We're afraid of being judged, or, there's a social anxiety afoot. That's what the nakedness symbolizes. I think we must ask ourselves when reading the Gospels and looking at the story of the cross, the story of a crucified Messiah, we need to ask ourselves, what anxieties and traumas were plaguing first century Jews that made them believe that God had been crucified? To be clear, I think Jesus of Nazareth was a real person who said and did remarkable things, but a certain kind of mythos and legend grew up around him. And I think we must ask, why this idea of a suffering and crucified God? Why? What was going on in their lives that made them think this way or believe this way? What circumstances could make them believe that the God of the Exodus, the God who supposedly liberated their ancestors through power and might from the Egyptians, how is it that this warrior deity of power and might who showed up on the battlefield for Israel, they believed, and laid waste to their enemies and plagues and power from on high, how is it possible that this same God didn't show up to liberate them from the Romans? Think about that. And not only didn't show up to liberate them from the Romans, another foreign oppressor like the Egyptians, but was himself brutalized and ultimately executed by them in the most humiliating way possible, stripped naked and hung up on a cross. This is astonishing. Think about it. What could this possibly have represented? This was a radical reimagining of God on their part for many first century Jews. And really, it became a sort of utterly offensive, heretical, and nonsensical idea to many others who just couldn't wrap their heads around this idea of a crucified Messiah, the Son of God, the Son of God, the Son of the God who liberated us in power and might time and time again. Crucified? This is why Paul remarks in 1 Corinthians, we proclaim Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and utter nonsense to the Gentiles. The question is, what was behind this radical reimagining of God? And I contend it was the terror of the Roman occupation and the eventual fall of Jerusalem in 70 CE, which, by the way, the Gospels, the four Gospels, most scholars hold that they were written during or immediately after the fall of Jerusalem in 70 CE. And what is found, I think, there in those stories is this fact that they just couldn't reconcile their traditional belief in a God of power and might with the Roman occupation and the fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple, the desecration of the temple, the unthinkable nature of all of this was personified, symbolized in the crucifixion of God. Thus, God was reimagined from being a God of religious law and a God of power and might to a God of love and compassion, a God who stands in solidarity with the afflicted, the infirm, the broken, the outcast, the oppressed, the downtrodden, the poor, the powerless. God is revealed as that God, a God who no longer needs a temple in Jerusalem to inhabit, which laid in ruins anyway, to a God who now inhabits us, his people, as a Holy Ghost, if you will, the ghost of a God who once was, but now has become beloved community itself, the community of those who embody his love and compassion for others, but especially for the least of these. Again, I'm not saying that all of this was clearly understood and believed by the first Christians who were all Jews, because I don't think it was. But I think it was unconsciously what was going on behind the scenes, going on behind this shocking story of a crucified Messiah. And again, I'm looking at this like a therapist analyzing their client's nightmare. The question is, what traumas, anxieties, and antagonisms are going on in this person's life to make them dream this way? What difficult and painful things are they trying to process and cope with? Now, some might ask, doesn't it devalue the Gospels to turn them into a myth? And I say, no, absolutely not. I actually believe I'm valuing them highly as a sacred story that speaks of deeper truths that help us cope with reality, the reality of life, the reality of death, and the fact that life is tragic and unfair and unjust, and nobody's coming to save the day. Doesn't matter how hard you pray or how much faith you have, shit happens. And those are the facts. And death is inevitable, and suffering is inevitable. Tragedy will be visited upon each and every one of us. We must drink from this cup. We cannot escape it. And these are hard truths that I believe the cross represents. And inside that understanding is this idea that we must become Christ in the world. We must become the presence and power of God in the world. We must embrace these truths, make peace with them so that we can be fully here with each other in the midst of life as Christ was with us. We must be with each other. And the only way we can be truly present, truly with each other, is by acknowledging reality, acknowledging the reality of our lives together, and not escaping into fantasy worlds that religion is so good at producing, like a drug. In other words, the only question that matters is this one. In light of the fact that life is tragic and no one's coming to save the day, how then shall we live? And the answer, according to the scriptures and according to James Baldwin, is the same. The answer is love, period. The love of life and the love of others is the answer. As Baldwin says, it is the only beacon of hope in that terrifying void from which we came and to which we shall surely return. One must negotiate this passage as nobly as possible for the sake of those who are coming after us. But again, I think Baldwin knew that many, perhaps most people, don't want to experience the reality of death, or maybe we are incapable in some ways of acknowledging this reality fully, accepting it. He knew that most people would rather escape reality and imprison themselves, as he put it, in totems, taboos, blood sacrifices, steeples, mosques, races, armies, flags, nations, in order to deny the fact of death, which is the only fact we have, he says. In other words, he knew that people would rather escape into religion or other cultural constructs to escape reality, the reality of our mortality. Baldwin believed, more than anything else perhaps, that religion often got in the way of social progress. And yet, he understood, like many civil rights activists of his time, that the civil rights movement was a deeply religious movement, deeply, deeply religious. He understood that it was inspired in large part by the nonviolent Christianity of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., but also it was inspired by Malcolm's Muslim faith. The Black Power movement was entirely inspired by Malcolm's Muslim faith. And in some ways, we talked about James Cone in the previous week. James Cone was a Black activist and an author, speaker, theologian from that same period who kind of bridged the Christianity and the Islam, the Christianity of King and the Islam of Malcolm together into what became Black liberation theology. But to be clear, the civil rights movement was a deeply religious movement. Baldwin, I think, understood this, but he would have acknowledged that. But he also knew that there was a direct correlation between religion and racism. Because religion, namely, of course, American Christianity, existed in large part to reinforce white supremacy. Religion exists in most cultures, to a great degree, to reinforce dominant power structures and cultural norms. In the United States, historically speaking, that meant reinforcing white supremacy and capitalism, as it does today still. Religion is so good at doing this because it provides a unique set of emotionally powerful ideas and stories and traditions that people can gather around that define who we are, what life is about, and how we can cope with life's innate problems like death. That makes religion a uniquely powerful tool in the hands of the powerful to control people and to serve hegemony. God is like the ultimate big other, the ultimate authority figure, right? Who can be co-opted by the state or culture to reinforce whatever they want to reinforce. And unfortunately, throughout history, Christianity has been used to reinforce fascism and all kinds of state violence. Go all the way back to the 3rd or 4th century in Constantine, right? When all this trouble really began. But I think we must ask ourselves today, why does Christianity lend itself so easily to fascism? Like we see in Europe in the 1930s and 40s, and like we're seeing today in the United States. Why does Christianity lend itself so easily to fascism? Well, consider that fascism, like a lot of religion, is fundamentally a kind of fantasy about the way we wish the world was. A fantasy, well, fascism, like fundamentalism, is an escape from reality into a fantasy world often of racial and national purity, a kind of utopian fantasy about how a particular class and culture is chosen by God to rule, to dominate, to assert themselves over all others. White Christian Europeans have historically believed that they're chosen. They are chosen by God as the religion, racial, cultural pedigree, heritage that should dominate the world, if not at least the Western Hemisphere, but the world. This is colonialism. This is whiteness, historically speaking, in cahoots with Christianity. The conquistadors, the early settlers of the Western Hemisphere, European settlers of the Western Hemisphere, came with the cross in hand as a tool of subjugation and assimilation of the native inhabitants of this part of the planet. These fascist ideas have been around for generations. This is nothing new. And today, American Christians of European ancestry, aka the WASPs, and I'm one of them, aka the evangelicals, of which I'm no longer, they have bought into this fantasy. It is a fantasy. This fantasy, hook, line, and sinker. They subscribe to it. And this is not just a political fantasy, but a religious fantasy with fascist and deadly consequences, civilizational level consequences, really. So as long as God is the means by which we create and sustain fantasies about the way we wish the world was, religion and racism, religion and fascism will go hand in hand. And I think Baldwin understood this connection better than most. And I think we here understand this connection better than most because our religious deconstruction from evangelicalism was also a political deconstruction from Christian fascism and white supremacy and the fantasy of it all. The death of the God of religious fundamentalism, the death of the almighty, all-powerful God on high who can solve all your problems if you just do the right thing and believe enough and pray enough, yada, yada. The death of that God for us was also the death of the God of white supremacy, the death of the God of homophobia, the death of the God of patriarchy, et cetera, and so on and so forth. I want to finish today with two quotes, one from Dostoevsky and the other from Mel Brooks. There's a juxtaposition for you. Dostoevsky once said, the one thing I dread the most is being unworthy of my sufferings. I feel the same way. I want to be worthy of my sufferings by confronting with integrity, as Baldwin puts it, the conundrum of life. I want to learn from my sufferings, from the radical embrace of my mortality and frailty as a human being, and the unknowing and uncertainty of what, if anything, comes after. I want to learn from this. I want these sufferings, this radical embrace of reality, to be my teacher. A teacher who shows me how to live and love life to its fullest, how to be fully present for myself and others, and how to love others to their fullest. Only suffering, I think, can teach us this. And I also like this quote from Mel Brooks. Relax. None of us are getting out of here alive. Some of you were nodding even before I completed the sentence. You've heard it before. Relax. None of us are getting out of this thing alive, which I take to mean chill. In the end, everything comes to nothing, which is a take on the book of Ecclesiastes. Vanity of vanity, all is vanity and futility to chasing after the wind. Everything comes to nothing in the end. You came into this world with nothing, you leave it with nothing. So enjoy the ride for as long as you can. Try not to take life's problems too seriously. Live and love, eat, drink, and be merry, because nobody knows when their time is up. Now that sounds a little bleak, maybe a little depressing, but I don't think it is. I think that's actually wonderful. I think that's deeply life-affirming and celebratory. But that's me. And I think Baldwin had the same view. But where are you at with all of this today? I said a lot. As always, we want to open it up for comments, reflections, questions, disagreements. Julie has something. If you need a prompt, and I'll prompt you with this. How has your theological shift coincided with your political shift? How has your religious deconstruction informed your political deconstruction? If that helps anybody. But Julie, yeah.
Yeah, okay, I'm going to cry because I'm informed in, first of all, I love your talk, Aaron. Thank you. You're such a good teacher. And I actually think I'm agreeing with you, but I'm going to say almost the opposite of what you said.
Cool.
Which is that in some ways, I think it's that we're afraid of life.
We're afraid of life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm reading this novel by George Saunders. It's his newest novel, which is just, it's literally like turning me inside out. I was reading it last night and I just started weeping because one of the characters who's already passed on to the next life and acts as this sort of like angel hospice nurse to this man who's dying. There's just these like 20 pages where even though she's been like elevated in the afterlife, she cannot help but want to go back to her life, back to her body, back to the people that she loved and the town that she loved. And it got to me, this idea of elevation and the afterlife where like things are going to be better, but like it's good here, even right now. Like, and it just all like came upon me and I started weeping and I started tearing up again when I'm listening to your talk, because I think what we're afraid of also is just our embodied lives.
Yeah.
Because they are fucking hard. they're so hard. But to me, being Christ in the world is learning how to live even though it's hard, learning how to love even though people disappoint you, learning how to keep traveling even though there's mountains and valleys. Like, that is the thing to embrace. To be Christ in this world is to confront all of that and link arms with other people. And to some extent, I think that those Christians whom we've all left and ended up here instead are like thinking of the afterlife, not only because they're afraid of death, but because they're afraid of life. They're thinking, it's so hard here, there must be something better afterwards. And just watching this character in this story, because she's lived her life, she's been elevated, she's free of pain, but she like wants her body and her people and her town and life back. And it just was so moving to me. And to me, it relates to your idea of, what the crucifixion teaches us is we have to be Christ for one another in this life. Because if there is something after this life, our idea anyway is that it's going to be nothing like this life. And we might find that when we get there, we really miss all the lifeiness of life. That when we don't have bodies, we can.
I think it's beautiful. And I hear you saying, like, you're defining faith as the courage to be. The courage to be. Faith as the courage to be.
And I think for me, one of the very early developments in my own theology deconstruction was that what the cross meant, at least for me, what the cross and resurrection, what Easter meant really was that you could do the right thing and stand up for other people and you'd be okay, right? That was the resurrection. That sort of, there was this like safety net that you could do the right thing, the hard thing, and experience resurrection. And so early on, I don't know what I think about this anymore, but that the suffering of the cross, which I was taught, we're all called to as a way to, obtain eternal life. I started to think of it as, well, if Jesus can do the right thing and stand up for other people and commit himself to love and justice, then so can we, with that there won't be any ultimate drawback to that because you're resurrected. I don't know if I believe that anymore, but that's you asked.
Oh, you don't have to. I just put a prompt out there. You don't have to answer my prompt ever. You don't have to say anything that I say.
It's about faith.
Well, what I said to you just a minute ago.
Yeah.
Faith as the courage to be. It sounds like you're talking.
Yeah. So that's what I was thinking is, that faith to me, the crucifixion is a way of telling us all to have courage. Because it's gonna be okay.
That's an understanding that's been around for a long time. That maybe, I don't know. Maybe progressive Christians are better at embracing than others. But yeah, good stuff. Thanks, Julie. That's really good. Somebody else today. Any thoughts? Who? Oh.
Was kind of.
Well, welcome back, by the way.
I was just thinking, what's that saying? You can tell a lot about the people by the gods they serve.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Because I was just thinking
the God you believe in tells me more about you than God.
Right.
Yeah.
I was just thinking about that. So when you were talking about it did help me to think about it and deconceptualize. I was just reading a book about Greek mythology, and like the Greek gods are petty and vengeful, and they're horrible, and it's like awful. And then thinking about, like you said, the tide of Exodus, which is this tide of miracles, like the only way you can get out is a miracle, right? Like it's this divine, the chosen person, the miracle. And then thinking about the crucifixion and knowing that Romans crucified people constantly.
Yes.
And all the time. And the whole thing it's like no one's safe ever from them. And Jesus is this person who literally never did anything to anyone. I mean, that's part of the teaching. As I remember, Steve Harvey said that he was like, he's supposed to be like the perfect person, and he's still not crucified.
Right.
You know, right? So it's like he never did anything, and they still crucified him. And so thinking about what you were saying, it's just like, yeah, not even God is safe from all this, right? Not even God is safe. Period. That's what it means. But yeah, we get this resurrection, which gives us hope that there is something. I don't remember when I read this or heard this, but somebody said hell was a real place. And like the hell that they talked about was like this actual valley.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So
Yeah, just outside the gate of Jerusalem, there was a Gehenna, it was known as. Yeah, the kind of the trash dump.
yeah. And it was like another hell where people were dumped and all that stuff. So it's just that was it.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Akila. Other thoughts today? Yeah, Jose.
I have this great talk. I really liked it. And I think there's a through line through what you said from the beginning, talking about the civil rights movement and tying into this, into that, because I think maybe this is me being a leftist.
Own it, Jose.
But I do think that the through line there is the oppression has been enforced by the white European cultures, right? So we see the oppression of white culture in the civil rights movement in Black Americans and other Americans of color. But then, as we're talking about death and this sort of fear of death, I do think, I was just having this conversation with some friends earlier this week, that I see it now as an American view, but I do think it is a European view. This inherent fear of death is a pretty like Anglican, like white thing. Because if you look at other cultures, they're not afraid of death. Death isn't.
It's treated differently.
It's treated differently,
Yeah.
right? I mean, one of my favorite traditions is shaking the devil that they do in New Orleans, right? It was like when you die, they kind of bring you around and they take you to different places in like your casket. It's called shaking the devil off, and it's like the celebration of life instead of just like putting you in a hole, meditating all sad, right?
Mm.
And one of the quotes that I love, when you were talking about this, that reminded me of it, I have to read it, is Guillermo del Toro. They asked him once about, because he's got all these movies that deal with like monsters, darkness, and terror. And they asked him like how we can balance that with his joyful and like loving personality. And he said, I'm Mexican. And then everybody laughs. He says, no one loves life more than we do, in a way, because we're so conscious about death. So the preciousness of life standing side by side, the one place we're all going to. Everybody in this planet boarded a train, and that was the final destination, death. So the train, we're going to live. We're going to have beauty and love and freedom. And I think that when you eliminate one of the two sides of the equation, it's a pamphlet. When you take into account the dark to tell the light, it's reality. And that just kind of encapsulates this idea that I think one of the most successful things that the oppressors have done is make us afraid to live. And by constantly pushing this fear of what you have, you're going to die one day. And like this fear of death, they've stripped us from being able to enjoy life, because now you're spending your entire life being afraid of dying, which is ironic, right? You're already dead at that point because you're not living. And I was, as a child, I was so afraid of death. Like I would lay in bed just being like, I'm going to die someday. That's so scary. And I was like in 5th grade. And I was like, that is terrifying. And as an adult, I've always looked back and wondered, like, where did that come from? Because my parents were never like, yeah, man, you got to be so scared to die. Like we had family members that passed away, but my parents were never like, it's so sad. For sure, I think they were sad that they weren't around. But my parents always talked about how it was like a good thing that they had died, right? They growing up Catholic, they believed they had gone somewhere else, but it was a kind of like a rejoicing that they didn't have to suffer on this for anymore. And I think a lot of it came from, going to church and having this thing out in my head of like, you have to be good now because you're going to die, and where are you going to go when you die? And I think that is sort of like one of the most successful things that those in power have done to us. And I just, everything that you touched on, why Christianity has lent itself to these fascist movements, I think, because it's much easier to control people who already believe in a higher power, who are already being called to serve something greater than them, or this thing greater than them, and they can come in and you equate yourself to that greater thing, right? You start saying, well, we're just like God, we are the God here. We're doing what he wants us to do. And I think in one of your previous talks, you talked about how the church took, I think it was back when we were at the other location, you talked about how the church had kind of pulled away from this mysticism, this idea that God lives in all of you, to be like God lives in the church, because all of a sudden, if God lives in every one of you, then why are the people up here better than people down here, right? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't even know how to gather thoughts. That's just kind of what I was thinking.
No, it's good.
It's kind of all over the place, but yes.
We need to talk about that more. And I appreciate as a community of people who've deconstructed, who are recovering from kind of psychological trauma growing up in a particular ideology, we really need to reconstruct around mysticism, this idea that we are all, as Christ presented, especially in John's gospel, this radical idea, we are all one. He is in us, we are in him. There's this idea that this deep mystical idea of connection to the divine essence, the logos, that we are all divine reflections of the divine. We need that, I think, as a spiritual community in particular. I appreciate you bringing that up. And we need to get away from this kind of believing in the authoritarian lawgiver on high, because that is exactly, as you pointed out, is what allows so many Christians today to easily buy into fascist authoritarian ideas, because they already worship an authoritarian lawgiver in the sky that you better believe in and obey, or you are doomed. And you better not just believe and obey, you better sycophantly, fawn over him and worship him. This guy who's going to throw you and your children into everlasting fire if you don't believe the right things. That has absolutely set people up to buy into all kinds of fascism and violent ideologies. And anybody who doesn't see that connection and how the proclivity of evangelicals is there to just go right along with a fascist regime as an emissary or representative of the big other in the sky, it's obvious. But anyway, thanks, Jose. Anybody else?
Thanks. Yeah.
Okie doke.
Yeah,
sure.
What you said, fawning or fear of this God, what came up for me immediately was those are two of the 4 traumatic responses.
Yeah.
What it's fight, flight, fawn, freeze. And it's why is our relationship to God that of trauma?
It's really sad.
How do we deconstruct that?
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah. Good stuff. Well, we can continue the conversation afterwards, but let's conclude our formal time together, as well as you, with this joint benediction. It's a wonderful way to kind of centralize. Ooh, did I say something?
Ooh.
Nice when that happens. Well, anyway, let's say this joint affirmation and benediction together now. As we go from this place, we commit ourselves to the path of love, honesty, and humility. We dedicate ourselves to the cause of justice and the courageous embrace of this life, this world, and each other. Amen. Thank you for being here today, everybody. Thank you to all of you who joined us online over Zoom. You matter. And thank you to all of you who listen to the podcast later. Go in peace. Yeah.
And please take these copies home if you're interested in.
Thanks for listening in on this week's edition of the Central Cast. Hope you enjoyed it and hope you join us next time. Bye-bye.